According to self-determination theory, there are three basic psychological needs: autonomy, competence, and relatedness. My goal is to raise $500 for autonomy. I practice competence by making art. I practice relatedness by going live. There is an alternate reality where my car didn't get totaled during the pandemic that would change the autonomy that I have. A lot of people are beginning to realize how car-centric our country is as the US. Not being able to meet my basic psychological needs has been damaging to my mental health. I can describe which things make it easier. It's money. Presumably, there is a person who will have me do anything for the amount of money that is necessary for me to accomplish the goals that I can describe. If I enter a role and the role is considered underemployed, there is a person who could fill that role and grow with it more than I could. Additionally, the work that I do impacts actual people, and not doing this work means the actual people who benefit from it will not benefit from the work that I'm doing. I describe what I do pretty often, and you can ask me more about it on a TikTok Live. The bottom line is that if we want to improve the system, we need to fund the people who are trying to improve the system. Let me show you some of my art. This is an autumn pile that's accessible to a variety of creators who want to describe that they have seasonality to what they do. I make piles like this to open the opportunity for dozens of creators to describe something more tangible than having language and feeling like they need to market themselves constantly. On TikTok, it's possible to post a video that has a theme and tag people, and depending on your microeconomy, you can have that video be friends only, and you can find others to follow who have alignment and an interest. Today is December 3rd, so I'm going to update the Christmas countdown clock to 22 days until Christmas. Microeconomies work with familiarity and rapport. Presumably, the reason that a company exists is to reduce the friction between people who would exist in a microeconomy. One of the patterns that happened in companies is that you would be hired by a team over the course of months, and then the decision to fire you or keep you came down to one person, which isn't really how systems can be the most effective. Tech leadership has tried to go the social route, the political route, and now it seems like the way change can happen is physically. Like the physics of communication, which systems make it physically possible for a microeconomy to not dissolve when one person has a bad day? So that's why TikTok exists with the structures that it does, because we can point to work that we've done. There are some of my videos from last year that got 3,000 views this week. So presumably the work that I do can scale that way. It does require playing the TikTok game and learning from the algorithm, but the good thing is that my major in college was learning and education studies with a concentration in applied learning science. When I go live, I often have conversations with other people who relate to the process of engaging in microeconomics, also the process of learning. A call to action is to help me reach the goal of achieving more autonomy by being able to navigate an economy while also being able to apply the competence of understanding that I have skills and the people who describe benefiting from those skills and the people who I care about who benefit from my presence are the people who I want to relate to. Here are some paintings. This one says, "Leadership is a quality," and this one is one of the community favorites. I update these paintings relatively often, like somewhat often, because seeing how they develop over time and seeing how their development depends on how they, like where they came from and which subject they're about is interesting. Which subject they're about is interesting. A lot of people say that I'm too abstract, which is confusing to me a bit because I can navigate the structures in the computer pretty effectively. And authors produce language, and the amount of abstraction that authors navigate feels very similar. From my perspective, a lot of people engage with media that don't challenge them cognitively and then find it difficult to engage with the amount of attentional shift that software engineers need to navigate. This can make it ironic during the hiring process because in order to hire someone who can pay more attention than you do, you need to be able to pay attention more than you believe you can. Unless something about the hiring and employment process changes, currently the media across generations isn't being shared because attention flows differently depending on the physics of the medium. Here's some art from a couple years ago. If you've been following me for that long, then you'll probably recognize a couple of these pieces, because earlier on I used these as backdrops for just describing some of the concepts that I was working through. Part of the concept of describing familiarity is acknowledging that when we just navigate feeds of algorithms and the things that we experience, like the things that we watch, we can't actually describe as a meaningful moment that was spent, like a time that was made, that makes it easier for other people to understand their world or increment their relationship with each other. I feel like we can change some of the psychological development that's happening at scale. So the point of me showing this is to describe that there's a logo concept that's happening in the background. Some of these cardboard spray painted, what are these? Some of these pieces are specifically to describe my relationship to the motion of my logo. So I can describe that motion design doesn't need to remind us of AI. It is possible to have tangible media. And this is also something, because if I don't describe that I have the painting chops, that I have the actual value of spending the time, and I can talk through my art, then a lot of the peeps who have the ability to just scroll through a video will. So there is some amount of sales talk. Like I feel like Vince from ShamWow. I talk through the stuff that I'm trying to get through just to maintain the interest. But honestly, if everyone notices that everyone is having a hard time paying attention, and something that's required to learn is an amount of attention to be able to digest the subject that we experience, something that I can describe as a learning scientist is that it just does take practice. It is possible to practice across modalities. So as I flip these over, think about the senses, like the sensory experience of what you see and how that relates to what you're trying to do. It does require practice to be able to pay this kind of attention. And if you have the luxury of not needing to practice, then you might not. But it isn't necessarily the best for your long-term cognitive development. And that's kind of a hard thing to make a lot of adults pick up, engage with. It just doesn't seem fun to think about thinking so much. But it can be. You can play with art, and playing can be such a fulfilling activity. I remember when I was younger, I used to make books with my folks, and that was a very meaningful experience. And it kind of feels like it got replaced with just the idea that you can pour your time into a box. But the thing, like the difference between making a book with a parent and watching TV is that it's less likely that you're going to look back on the hour that you spent watching TV because it won't come up as an experience in a physical form. So having the ability to reflect on the tangibility of these pieces and being able to associate the actual meaning, like being able to see this is notebook paper and remembering something from school doesn't come out of nowhere. Like that is an experience that needs to come from somewhere. I have the memory of writing my name, my period, teacher's name, and the date in this top right-hand corner. And I wouldn't have that experience if I didn't actually interact with the tangible media this way. But currently, one of the directions is to digitize everything. And sometimes that seems like a good idea in the short term, because if you want people to learn, then you can create structures where they can learn in the abstract. What I want to say is, like, what are we learning and how is that helpful for developing a relationship across time with the structures that we want to relate to. This is back to the concept of one of the basic psychological needs is relatedness. How do we actually relate to the world that we share? If we go to a different city, are we going to describe shows that no one else has seen? If we interact with different generations, are we going to describe structures that they can't find familiar? And that's something that I appreciate about TikTok. Like, there are people who are working in microeconomies, who trade with each other, who purchase each other's books or seeds or what else, like the products that they make from those. So it is possible to make the world more tangible, but it does require sharing media. And that's something that I appreciate about TikTok. My goal is to raise $500. It helps if it's monthly, but in the short term, it would help to just have $500 to pay for a yearly bill that is related to how artists want to relate to their own art. And that's Midjourney. Midjourney is $300 per year. It's possible to pay for it monthly, and I am, but that's more expensive. And so a whole bunch of the monthly expenses are just more expensive than the annual version. And you can say there are about 6 annual versions that I need to pay for. Some of the annual versions that I need to pay for are more than $500, like $600 or $700. That's mostly Photoshop that I'm thinking of. What else? ChatGPT, I think, would be about $300 per year for Plus, or I could do $200 per month to make it through all of the art. And the idea is that as I go through a pile of art, then I can talk about how it relates to the Boon Bane Bone project and how that's related to generative storytelling. This says Boon for books, shows, movies, Bane for news, media, and syndicated press, Bone for math and science, Bonk for commentary, and Honk for squares. This is a square concept. So just going through this pile, I described 2 years of active development only to describe that I'm not trying to replace artists. I am trying to develop a more integrated frame so we can all share time and relate to each other. Because if our economy depends on navigating AI well, and nobody's learning AI, and our economy will collapse. But the alternative is that we're all doing what we're supposed to be doing by applying ourselves and developing skills. Having a job that we aren't going to apply ourselves in over time makes employers trust the workers less. Accidentally, it's just when the people seem like they don't care and we hired them to care, and the concept if you pay them more then they would care, but we can observe that that isn't true because there are things that people are doing for free. They just run out of energy, or they just run into circumstances where they can't afford to continue focusing on something. And a lot of it is that we aren't modeling social systems as if cognition is embodied. Social systems can be modeled and impact reality. Cognition is embodied. We exchange information. There are rates of change, and rates of change are abstract for a large number of people. A couple years ago, I read this book, Buy-In, Saving Your Good Idea from Getting Shot Down. And I've been able to get a couple peeps to buy into the concept that we can share time this way. We can come up with the idea of a generative novel and just not generate a novel. We can have the idea of, what if one day I went through all of my art and I turned it into a story, and then we can just not turn it into a story. I think I'd rather share love and strategy than enforce obligation. Now. So this concept is like, I can probably give this to a sound person and they can turn it into like a beat, or I can plug the seeds into Suno and have Suno generate some tones. Today is RPG Wednesday. It's a tradition weekly. These are the episodes: Honk About Pie, No More Boon Honk, and Bone to be Bane. I had a Kickstarter a couple years ago with those episode titles. Blueberry Fool is a recurring theme. So you can see I use the Boon Bane Bone motif pretty regularly, and with generative AI we can say, how many times in the video Did you see this specific symbol? Because I want to return to it. I want to make sure that if I put this in a box suddenly because I'm losing housing, that I have some sort of order associated with it, and I can turn this into a movie. Like, the idea that you can be an artist and have a body of work that is only meaningful when you die is a very toxic and extractive frame. We can be more strategic as entrepreneurs, as artists, and say that we are intentionally relating to the spirituality of creation. We are intentionally relating to the spirituality of design, of intent, of the reasons why humans would continue even though it's difficult. High school: interests, reference points, and structure, what you can develop. College: context, relationship, redirection, what we hope college is for. Here's some I think this is handmade paper. It might not be. No, I think this is from the craft store. This is an old piece that has been exposed to the light for a while. How much Boon Boon? I feel like that's a fun one. So some of these are actually pretty nostalgic to go through. I did have to go through this set of art to make sure the art I could go through and I wouldn't suddenly become sad when I interacted with the concept. And that's just part of it. Part of making art about experience is describing emotions that are difficult and putting them into a frame where others can see, well, there's a person in the world who was able to navigate this. In Boon Wonderground, in Boon Wonderground, Lore Bone, Bone Fact Shift, Boon Bane Bone. Boon Bane Bone Bonk Honk Boof Lore. So I'm trying to renew some of those domains, get them online, and have a Christmas episode released. If I can't afford to release a Christmas episode, then at least I described that this concept exists. I might post this to Patreon and have it accessible, reflect on it. Depending on the available energy, I might be able to update more of this later, depending on who's interested. What kind of dad? Which dimensions of partnership? Structure, relationship, strategy, operations, power, ethics. Well, there are a lot of dimensions. The spooky, hungry Bane. Need wonder about pie. Wonder about pie-full thinking. Honk wishes. So that's a fun one. Spooky, hungry bonk. The Boonculator. It's like a calculator made for Boon. Majored in learning, 10 years on GitHub, webmaster. So the idea here also is that you can probably have commercial breaks. Most people, like most developers, most people aren't going to be developers and artists specifically, although most people do develop, and creating art is such a positive experience for relating to difficult emotions. So I would recommend it, but most people aren't going to be in this frame. And I can make scenes from this video more available. Y'all know that I work with microeconomies. I had a job in college working for the Community Economic Development Department of the University of Illinois Extension Program, and I got an opportunity to reflect on publishing, the reasons why people produce media, the reasons why people care about sharing the experiences that they do. So y'all know, as the peeps who are watching this for business to business reasons, that there are going to be pieces that I make available, and TikTok can recognize some of the pieces, and if I post these one by one, then you can do the pause the video thing and return to something that has a similar shape. And because of my strong design sense, I've been able to post a lot of videos that have shapes you can return to, ideally through my logo, but sometimes the art that I make is in my style, and it's in the logo style, it's in the style of my logo. So why imagine? So sometimes if you pause the video and then you click find similar, then you'll see art that isn't directly my logo, but has my style. The general consensus from the teachers that care is that the problems we're navigating in society are getting worse and impact their students, who see things not changing and grow increasingly disinterested. So it's pretty important for the people who speak their language to describe a reason why motivation is good. Like literally, why is it necessary to have motivation and what can you do with it? Because currently, the students who are the most disruptive impact the classrooms. The teachers who are already spread thin don't have the resources to direct attention in different ways. And there are a lot of people who didn't receive the kind of specific developmental care that they needed when everything went remote. So the problems in society aren't abstract to the people we can ask about how they're feeling about navigating the classroom. Would you ever want to substitute teach? Currently, I make a lot of educational videos and I link to resources in my Discord about the psychology research that I study. Also, I'm developing a language to relate cognition to material science, to explore metamaterials as a learning scientist, so I can relate the process that I'm exploring. I'm going to stop you right there. It doesn't sound like that pays very well. You need to get some income. If you're an artist, I would recommend having experiences that you don't pimp out. And sometimes it can be frustrating because the urgency of describing meaning making is relevant mostly to the people who make meaning intentionally. This is a concept that I've been working on for a couple of years. When you see the scraps of paper that I have, one of my plans is to laminate them, but I also want to describe the value of these laminated folios first. The idea is that once we have a set of art and we have the minds to navigate it, to process it, to sort through it, we can cut out the shapes that we find engaging from paper and put them into a different arrangement, like a collage. And one of the processes then can be arranging those into a laminated collection. And then we can have that laminated collection just exist for a while and post this sometimes in the background and then paint it, like paint over the laminated sheets. And currently, I find this interesting visually. I don't necessarily like the way that it looks entirely. Like I believe if I wanted to make this aesthetic for another person, there are different things that I would do. But I can paint through these, and I know that the concepts that I've arranged are developmental towards a concept of computer science lore, like teaching people computer science by encouraging wonder about pi. So that's wonder-based learning, the pi mathematical construct, and also the pi recipe construct, being able to relate to my experiences working in a restaurant, and acknowledging that recipe sites from back in the day, the ways that we used to describe coding chops sometimes was by making a recipe site and sharing that with someone. But recipes of what? Because if you describe that you made a recipe site and it was just a project, then that isn't going to describe how you understand systems or how you relate to the business element of software development. So this is me pivoting from speaking to artists to speaking to software engineers, with the hope being that some of the artists can recognize their capacity to learn some structured language. Some of the software engineers can recognize their capacity to learn some of the more creative language. And also, y'all can relate to, this is a number of elements of pieces that took actual human effort. And there are somatic elements to it. Like you can feel the paint, you can hear the sound, it's textural. So if you're just seeing a whole bunch of AI generated art and you don't like it, you can know that there are people who are making art and it isn't, like, the experience isn't AI. The reason that you aren't going to see a lot of it is because it feels bad to pimp out the spiritual practices you have, and I wouldn't recommend it entirely. But in the context of this video is that I'm trying to raise $500 per month relatively consistently. In the context of December, I'm trying to raise $500 before the 13th so I can attend holidays through 2026. Otherwise, just logistically, it's going to be very likely that remaining in a position where I can describe specifically my needs and how they relate to my needs for autonomy, my needs for relatedness, my needs for competence, it is just kind of confusing to not be able to describe that I do have a budget. It's based in real people responding to real dimensions, etc. So I'm kind of hoping somebody sees this and invests $500 or $1,000 or $2,000 actually, so I can have 4 months of being able to think about the interview process. Because the last 2 jobs that I had, one of the interview processes was 4 months. One of them was 1 month, and I was at both companies for less time than the hiring process was. If I describe that to an audience of prospective juniors, they're going to be less motivated to actually make it through the hiring process, because they're going to believe that all of it's like that. And a lot of it is, but if we are more selective about the positions that we do entertain, then it won't be like that forever. And also we have blockchain technologies to describe what we're trying to do. So it is possible for the system to improve, for the system to enter, allow more people to enter, and stabilize some of the structures. I'm describing that artists can often be the meaning makers, and software engineers can often be the meaning organizers. Now we have new tools for doing both. So hopefully this is something that you can relate to. One of my plans for all of the art that I have is to get it into a space where if I suddenly lose housing, then I'm not as lost. Like the history of what I've been working on is not as abstract to the people who otherwise have attention spans that don't include the immediate disposition that I tend to have access to, which is just when you have a lot of people applying to a role, you're going to want to go towards the most optimistic and cheery people. So that's the plan. The plan is to increase my autonomy, competency, and my sense of autonomy, competence, and relatedness, specifically so I can improve my mood and also have the ability to make it through an interview process that's an ambiguous number of weeks long, sometimes multiple rounds, sometimes they have weeks between rounds, and there isn't feedback that indicates anything has gone wrong. On TikTok, we do have feedback, and that is something that I can learn from. I can ask people what they think about whatever I'm saying, and they can respond, and that is a direction, or is a dimension of meaning that can be made. So the takeaway is that once I have enough resources, I'm motivated to increment the art that I have. I might not be able to access this the same way always. Sometimes, like the perspective, what seems like it's the most likely is that I'm going to put this in a space that makes me feel sad to be in, and then I won't actually be able to engage with it until I can find a different way to change my circumstance. So one of my goals here is to go through the pieces that have meaning in a pile and be able to associate those with something that I post on TikTok. So in the future, if I come across an image because of a year in review feature, then people on TikTok can find the collection that it is associated with. And in the meantime, there are a few of these. I'm going to give some of these away as gifts, just as interesting tokens. It's pretty easy for me to arrange something from the collections of art that I've made, and I think that can be meaningful. I'm not sure how it's going to come across. Sometimes I've given people my art and it's been a long time, like I spent a long time working on it, and then the way it's received isn't necessarily with curiosity. It feels like sometimes the cost of gifts is compared to, like, it's the metric that people go for instead of the intent, which, you know, it is what it is. I also like the idea of going with something that's a bit more aligned. In my adult life, I liked the idea of being able to drive to see people and develop more of a relationship. My car got totaled when I was 23, and then I was in a city where I could mostly see people in the city, and you know, lockdown, different stuff like that. So generationally, it is hard to relate to, it seems. Like, how Gen Z is navigating the world and why there are different patterns. It is possible to get some Gen Z to a place, but it seems like when some Gen Z is doing well, then it seems like that's used as the example for how all Gen Z should behave. But there are just a lot of people, and the reason I describe this frame of media is like, I'm not sure who this video is going to reach. I don't know how long people watch videos. Some people watch videos because they like the sound of my voice, and sometimes they don't actually watch the video, they just listen to the sounds. It's possible to use a TikTok sound. It's possible to use snippets of a TikTok sound. So it is just a strange space. These are the folios that describe a production, like at least one production. I was a bean, boon honk at the seams. Seems it was just yesterday. I was tucked in the earth embrace. From sprout to stalk I rose. Each day a new chapter in my green tale. 2.boon.land. So currently this site is down. I don't mind that it's down because I want y'all to relate to time. Lore, oration, lore, print, lore, film. It's possible to use this as a seed for a movie. It's possible to relate to all of this art, to go through some sort of cleaning, not necessarily cleaning process, just some sort of processing process. Poem, how do I heal from things I can't? Yeah, this is an interesting one. Some of these are interesting to return to. Zine, design, development, declaration. So there's a printer. There's a printer in my community who makes zines, and I'm probably going to send a couple of these over to him so he can print them or have some sort of collage. I'm not sure when I'm going to be able to. If I have a couple weeks, or not a couple weeks, if I have a couple days where I can recharge my battery and enter a creative space and not feel like the way that I'm interacting with my art is with a context of maybe losing housing, then I can go to the library and just kind of vibe, just kind of feel like I'm playing with my art, and that can be a moment of joy that I have for myself. And then from that moment of joy, then I can create products that I don't mind pimping out. Currently, I haven't really been sharing this process because I do generally want it to be more of a, this is the way that I quietly reflect on my experiences. But it has become more apparent that this is disruptive to the people around me, which is understandable. It would help to have more autonomy in the economy, and that is the thing that I'm hoping someone hears and responds to. I appreciate the people who have contributed to parts of that. I've been able to navigate the world relatively. So this is one. I have another drawing of this character outside of this space. And I think that it's interesting that we can have a physical medium like this and tell a story digitally and ask Grok to animate. Like, what would happen if this character met the, I don't know the gender of this character. What if this character met their brother? Their sibling. It's interesting. Box of pie, boon, bane, bone. So I've been working on this boon, bane, bone concept for at least this long. And because this series has a similar style, I know it's from this series. I know that I'm probably not going to be motivated to go through, was this 80? I think it was 80 laminated sheets that are double-sided. So I'm just not necessarily going to have the energy to use at least the same color for another folio set. And there are also some sheets that I didn't laminate. I remember there are some sheets that I made that I didn't laminate, or I didn't paint over. So there are multiple series. You can say this is the purple series. And in the scope of looking back on an artist's career as they develop relationships, the question of why would art appreciate is how describable is it? How describable is it to whom? Who cares about who receives this art? So part of the reason why I gift art is so that it can be owned by others that others care about. I'm going to gift this to some of the peeps who I know who have a couple million followers probably. That's probably going to be when I can see them, and I might not have access to this. I might not have access to this art by the time that I can actually see those people. So that is just something that I'm thinking about. It is a strange experience to have navigated, etc. I'm going to talk more about that on TikTok Live later. The idea here is that you can have a pile of meaning, you can reflect on that pile of meaning. When people are looking for art and they're looking for meaningful art and they want to relate to that pile of meaning, it often feels like you're pimping out your experiences. And the moments of joy that you have quietly seem like they could be had quietly, but not necessarily in an environment. It says when closed mouths don't get fed, which is strange. And then the other concept is like everyone competes for every single role when everyone is desperate for money, which is a problem because the things that pop up aren't necessarily going to be oriented to make the world better. If we just know that we have desperate talent, then we can do anything. But hopefully that's something that y'all hear. And when we are aware that there are people who are they're afraid of being deported, what are the structures that we form as a society so the peeps who are the most afraid of being deported don't feel like they need to do desperate things just to exist? Because when that happens, the desperate decisions that people make aren't necessarily the most educated decisions, most well-informed, most pro-social. That's something I'm passively slipping in at the end of the video. I don't necessarily believe there are going to be people who watch this entire thing. I believe there are people who like the sound of my voice, and making videos like this is a way to connect to people who want to watch something that's kind of like slop, but actually has meaning and also has the tone of whatever it goes into it. When I can go to the recording booth, then I can make longer audio, and I have a couple podcast episodes that I'm waiting to release, and I will release them when it feels good to release them. And it'll feel good to release them when I have more autonomy, competence, and relatedness as the experience that I believe is the supported experience. Right now it feels like I'm describing an amount of work that is very intentional and for the future, and it isn't viewed as being valuable in the short term or in the long term. And it's a frustrating experience often. Today is Pi Day, which starts the first episode of Lore.land. Strange to look back on. The Kickstarter is at $3, which I'm grateful for. 2 backers have made pledges. I made an initial concept sketch for Mimes Against Wonder About Pi. Plot bucks. Input from one of the sites. So that's the concept. I hope you all pick it up. It's been true for about 2 years that making $500 per month would free up my time to focus only on the job interview process. It sounds like you need to make $500 per month. Currently, I often spend all of my time trying to make $500. If your job doesn't pay, then maybe it isn't an actual job. My job is to apply my skills to the problems that I can address. But you aren't addressing the problem of, we believe your art is clutter and we want to not see it. When that's the frame that I enter, I remember feeling worthless growing up. When the verb that I'm doing is putting away my art so it won't be seen, I feel like I'm losing housing again. Remember that it was your fault you lost housing. I make a lot of intentional decisions. Losing housing wasn't the intentional decision. You knew what would happen because you signed a contract. I learned from that experience. Also, having weed in the dorms wasn't that uncommon. I had peers on staff who also smoked. We noticed your personality change when you started doing substances. You noticed my personality change when I stopped hiding how I felt around you. I had felt that way for years before. It was one of the darkest times of my life. Cannabis was actually pretty helpful. It helped me focus on the things that I found motivating. Then I pursued those. But it didn't work. Otherwise, you wouldn't be here. I didn't expect for my car to get totaled during the pandemic. I also didn't expect to be upside down on the auto loan. While I was in a walkable city, it was okay for a bit. I anticipated being at the companies that hired me long enough for my equity to vest. So I made decisions at those companies that would be long-term. My major in college was, I'm tired of hearing about you go on about the past. But the past is relevant for describing why I'm navigating the present this way. You're getting escalated. You need to learn how to manage your emotions. To make it through the interview process, I would need $500 per month. Why don't you accept a part-time job that pays you $500 per month? Because then I wouldn't be able to schedule the time to make it through the interview process. But if you need the money, also I would need to be able to afford to make it to work. We could drive you. Sometimes you aren't here. Also, if I'm too sad, people think that my emotions aren't what they are, which can be dangerous for me. You need to learn how to control your emotions. You might say, that's what acting is. The reason you can't make it through the interview process is because you're angry all the time. I often have several hour-long lives where I'm not angry. I talk with my guests about what we're processing, and we learn together. Do you ever learn? We haven't heard you say anything that you've learned all week. We think it would be a good idea for you to learn. My major in college was Learning and Education Studies with a concentration in Applied Learning Science. You mention that pretty frequently, and I'm not sure how that's relevant. From my perspective, getting a job requires me to interface with the world. You need to get a job. I need to interface with the world. You have the internet for that. That's why I'm using this medium. You need to get a job. I need to make it through the interview process.